Welcome to Perspectives on Neurodiversity, a podcast dedicated to challenging myths and assumptions about neurodiverse life. I am your host, Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Some interviews for this season were recorded before I rebranded the podcast. I continue to blog as the Autistic Me, and that name will continue to be the social media handle for the blog and this podcast. Subscribe to Perspectives on Neurodiversity on your favorite podcasting platform. I hope you enjoy and learn from our discussions. Hello and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, an autistic parent of two neurodiverse young daughters. Receiving accurate diagnoses and appropriate supports from any autistic can be challenging. However, my wife and I have noticed young women face additional obstacles. Social challenges might be dismissed as shyness, for example. Diagnostic rates differ among genders globally, suggesting a serious international problem. Also, some experts suggest autistic women of all ages suffer greater anxiety, possibly connected to social pressures on young women to conform to social norms. Joining us for this episode of The Autistic Me is Kathy Carter, an autistic self-advocate, therapist, and counselor. Kathy is a UK-based online therapist serving a predominantly autistic client base. She trained with the UK College of Hypnosis and Hypnotherapy, a leading training provider specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy and practice. Kathy is registered in the UK with the General Hypnotherapy Register, the National Hypnotherapy Council, and the Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council. She's also the Neurodiversity Advisor for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy's editorial board. Kathy also works with the Irish organizations Thriving Autistic and the Adult Autism Practice, offering support to newly diagnosed autistics. Additionally, she works at a school as a counselor where many of the 10 and 11-year-old children she works with are neurodiverse. It is my honor to welcome Kathy Carter to The Autistic Me.
Wow, thank you so much, Christopher. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Let's begin with the most important reason I think your voice needs to be heard. You are a woman diagnosed as autistic.
Yeah, that's right. My journey started fairly recently in my mid-40s, 5 years ago. So I did spend, most of my life without that diagnosis, Christopher. So it certainly changed my life, knowing I'm autistic. But as you allude to and talk about all the time, there's a lot of girls, young women who don't have that privilege yet in their lives. So they're still striving to find out who they are.
I'm curious, how does someone who works with children, has trained as a therapist, how did you go into your 40s without the autistic diagnosis?
I only really got on that train when I became a mum, which was 9 years ago. And my son's autistic, he has ADHD. So it's quite a typical story of noticing things with your child which are a bit less typical than their peers. But because we're a neurodivergent household, my husband's ADHD, you don't necessarily notice that your child behaves in ways or has emotions that are slightly different to some of their peers because it's usual for your household. Yeah, it's only when they start going into the social settings and the school environments that you start picking things up. And then, thank goodness I went on that journey with him at the same time, really. But yeah, looking back, much like you've alluded to, I had all the anxiety, I had all of the issues around not fitting in, physiological things like IBS, many anxiety-based conditions, I suppose. So I just didn't know that autism was at the root of it.
In your practice, because you are an autistic self-advocate, you work with a lot of autistic individuals.
Yeah.
Does that help you connect to them, having that shared journey?
It really does. And I find it almost becomes a comparison because often by the time they find me, they've been through a system of, especially if they're young people, like child and adult mental health services, perhaps. They may have seen psychologists or some kind of talk therapist who wasn't really au fait educated about the autistic experience. So I think to find someone who is very in tune with their nervous system, even through online, which is how I work predominantly with the cognitive behavioural hypnotherapy. They are just a bit surprised almost that a therapist is honouring their autism. We prize it. We prize the way they process things. Just being in a room, it's like, turn up with your camera off, jump up, get some fiddle toys, sit in bed with your cats and your PJs. It's very respectful of their needs on the day. And I'm just not sure they've all had that sort of experience with, a traditional therapist who's not got that neurodivergent lens to look through, I suppose. But yeah, I do find I connect with them very easily. Yeah, it's great.
As I mentioned in the introduction, my daughters were late diagnoses. Even though my wife and I noticed that there were issues and we tried to explain them, educators and even some mental health experts will say, well, she's just shy. Or when it came to coordination, well, girls aren't as athletic and outgoing as some boys are. And there were a lot of these layers of gendered assumptions that occurred. In many ways, those became anxiety-inducing because, as I said, the girls are expected to be social. They're expected to play together. They're expected to be these cooperative, conciliatory identities that sometimes the autistic individual isn't. How do we help counselors and teachers notice that women who are autistic may not express their autism in the same way as autistic males or across the gender spectrum as we look at things, that there are differences in how autism reveals itself?
As you allude to, it is education, isn't it? It's getting the word out there. Certainly in this country, the training for teachers around issues of neurodiversity, it is very small. It's more like if you have an interest, you can go and seek out that amount of CPD, but it's not necessarily part of your training. So I think it takes a teacher to have had that drive to go and seek it out themselves. And I'm reflecting a bit here, Christopher, on my own experiences as well, but also with the girls I see at the school that you mentioned. So yeah, the girls, maybe if we're talking younger girls, they can compensate a little better sometimes than their male peers in terms of compensating for their differences, if you like. The expectations around their social circles, as you said, are quite different. The way they interact is perceived to be quite different. I love how you mentioned the anxious presentation, because that for me is a massive, massive part of the gender divide. And I see it. And again, I've only really got my snapshot of kids at the school. So I'm there because we set up a program for kids within the curriculum. It's a mainstream school with social and emotional mental health needs. They just happen to be neurodivergent, a lot of them. That's almost not why I was there in the first place, but then I very often see these kids because they're marginalised or their needs aren't met, perhaps. But certainly working with them on my client base, I see a more emotional or anxious presentation in the girls, as if their nervous system energy is higher, like more faster processing. That's often harder to spot sometimes in a school setting. Whereas if you've got a boy who's maybe a bit more isolated, more specific special interests, bit dissociated from his emotions, the girls might be almost hyper associated with their emotions. I feel like the boy might stand out more and the girl might just be described, well, there's lots of disparaging ways, isn't there? They're either too shy and you're too sensitive, that sort of thing, or they're too much for people. They're just, too loud, too silly. It's as if you can't win. Yeah, and they mimic, don't they, as well? Girls are quite adept at mimicking, and we want to fit in. That's what most of us want to do at school. You want to get through the process, fit in. So yeah, if the teachers can just be more educated through their own school, through their own training and their professional training, or just through CPD. There's millions of webinars, books, podcasts, as you well know, that would really help them to engage more.
In our household, we moved towards CBT here in Texas with help with Baylor University. The idea of overcoming negative self-talk, negative self-image, negative self-feedback is where we found CBT can help with the anxiety. But most autism practitioners in the United States, the therapy services, are applied behavioral analysis. ABA sort of dominates as where many of us who are autistic or who are advocates would like to move from ABA to things like CBT, which are more aware of that individual's desires to change certain behaviors or overcome certain anxieties. How do you approach CBT and its relationship to the autistic and his or her individualized needs?
That's such a great question. I'm not a supporter of ABA. I don't know, in my sort of circle, I don't know any autistic folk who are, to be honest. I wouldn't really support anything that is coercive, and that would include even social skills training. That just doesn't sit well with me. CBT, I think, is great. I had it myself before I sort of did it professionally. You'll find some resistance to it in relation to the autistic community. And I think that's because CBT likes us to be very flexible in your emotions, flexible in your thought processes, a lot of acceptance about what is, a lot of, flexibility in how you think about things, take that belief, change it to a new belief. But we as autistics are quite structured and inflexible, which is okay, by the way. Certainly, I would say to anyone looking for CBT or hypno-CBT or any BT, make sure it's offered from a neurodiversity affirming place. There's lots of areas where I'm not looking to change people's behaviours. If your way of coping with something is to not go to an event, to stand in the corner of an event, I'm not going to train people to be more assertive, more something they're not, which I think sometimes CBT can do a little bit. It's almost like, here's your deficit, mind over matter, let's solve it. So I would come at it with a much more organic approach, I suppose, quite streamlined to the autistic need. And I do add in, which isn't really CBT, a real emphasis on the nervous system, because for me, autistic folk are prone to dysregulation of the nervous system. Like, I see it without fail. I feel it in myself without fail. It's a fact in my worldview. I feel you can't access all of that sophisticated cognitive work unless your body's regulated. I saw a client today who was quite shut down in his processes, an autistic client. He's so exhausted just processing what needs to happen in the day that you can't suddenly throw out some CBT moves and let's think about this, let's realign this. It's about their nervous system on the day, I think. I would say CBT needs to respect our state at any given time. That's my view.
And you also use hypnosis, and you work with clients on forms of, is it referred to as self-hypnosis?
Yeah, it's the type of hypnosis I do is not your sort of trance. I'm working online, and I always say to clients, I'm not doing this to you. This is a process you can do to regulate yourself. So yes, self-hypnosis, would be very linked to mindfulness, meditation. Commonly, especially with autistic folk, the people I mentioned who might be more heightened, maybe with that more anxious presentation, sometimes they find it very hard to rest and relax and find the relaxation response. They might find it hard to get to sleep, maybe whizzing thoughts, looping sounds, words, lyric. It's that fast processing. So for them, hypnotherapy might be progressive muscle relaxation. It might be real body work, to calm the body down. Some people would like it to be quite a busy process. So let's rehearse this, now go through the scene again. What would, with our new viewpoint, with our new ideals and our new beliefs, what would you look like? How would you feel? What thoughts would you have? That's quite dynamic, isn't it? It's a lot of thinking power. So it depends on the client, and you can rehearse stuff. I've got a big meeting, I've got a big wedding, I feel a bit awkward. How could I get through that? Okay, well, let's practice some skills, do a little hypnosis and rehearse it. Or go back. Sometimes we might pop back to some experiences on a little timeline and maybe revisit how that felt and so on. So it's quite versatile, actually, I find. But yes, self-hypnosis, very much they can do this at home as well, practice these skills at home.
And how does this compare for those of us who do have strong opinions on ABA and other approaches? In those other approaches, one reason we reject them, I do personally, is the use of aversions or rewards. If you don't do this, there's this consequence, and it's either very negative or very positive. So how does CBT adjust that paradigm of punishment and reward so it is more humane and more intrinsic?
Yeah, I get the impression it's just about the therapist, because if you're working in a very client-centered way, and if you're working as a neurodiversity affirming therapist, no matter what your modality, I get the impression you will always put the client's true needs first. So yeah, I mean, the concept of like rewards-based stuff just doesn't come into what I do at all. It feels quite different, that more, it's almost like the operant conditioning versus the more, what do you need? You know, what do you need in this moment? And maybe we can reframe that. It feels like two completely different paths to me. So I guess it depends on the practitioner and what their background is and what their interest is. And also I'd add, I sort of fall into the DBT camp a little bit, the dialectical behaviour therapy, which is a very close fit in my mind with hypno-CBT as a modality. Yeah, again, that sense of accepting what's going on, regulating your body, you know, knowing what your needs are, from intolerance to uncertainty, for example. What's happening to your body when you're feeling heightened, when you're feeling hypervigilant? You know, what can you do to regulate it? For me, it's the behaviour side, but it's quite body related, I suppose. I'd lean more towards the body and less towards those cognitive aspects, and certainly not the rewards and everything.
And it's important that we not separate the mind and body, because the mind is the body. When our oldest is anxious, I can tell. And if you take her pulse rate, her heart rate will be in the upper 90s to low 100s. Her heart is beating at 100 beats per minute. She's clearly anxious. There are physical manifestations to that anxiety, to the PTSD from how she has navigated life. I think too often, both therapists on the mental health side and doctors on the physical side don't make those connections, that maybe the stomach pain, the headaches are connected to stress. It becomes somewhat of a loop, right? You're suffering physically, so you suffer yet more emotionally, and then that causes yet more physical distress. Could you address why our anxieties and our mental health need to be linked to our physical self-care and our mental health care? Why do those go hand in hand?
Oh, that's such a great question and a great topic. I literally can't separate them. So story follows state is my, it's not my mantra, I didn't invent it, but it's something I follow. So anxiety is an emotion. It's a biological process. Afterwards comes the story, the thoughts, the narrative we give ourselves, but it's biological. You know, it happens in the body. We can go on and give it names after a while, and, you know, we can replay these little stories we've got about the past or about phobias, but the original state was biological. So I find it bizarre that people would in any way want to separate them. And obviously, as you say, it's very, very common. There's more holistic practitioners, and I count myself as one, who do integrate them. But for me, no matter what a client comes with, so even if someone's come for phobias or something, I always will start with the physiological stuff. You know, how connected are you to your body? The sort of somatic responses. I'll say to people sometimes, do you know when to have a wee? Do you know when to drink? You know, how connected are you to these quite sort of primitive autonomic processes? Because if we're not in connection with our body, that's when we disassociate from the trauma with the PTSD. That's how we get the physiological issues. Myself, I had loads of anxiety stuff. It was autistic burnout, basically. I was diagnosed with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, in my teens. I had many stomach stress type issues as a child, ketoacidosis, lots of issues which in hindsight, you're like, yes, it's stress related, obviously. But, you know, they weren't picked up on. Now I would always put them together. And yes, if you can regulate the body according to your needs on the day and according to what your nervous system needs, you've got a much better chance of staying well. I'm all for medication, by the way. That's what a lot of people need, but I think it can easily be dished out without really, addressing the base need underneath that. What's going on for that person. So yeah, the mind and body are completely prioritized.
And for an autistic, that might be affecting their diet. It might be affecting, as you said, some basic routines.
Yeah.
I noticed that we have one daughter, the youngest, Anne, will overeat. She is always suffering from food anxiety, that the fear of not having food, the fear of going hungry, as where Lee, the oldest, will forget to eat, forget to drink.
Yeah.
There isn't a single approach. There isn't a single way of approaching how they manifest their stress and anxiety.
Yeah, it's all down to the individual client or student. All of this applies at a school, doesn't it? Or, whatever service we're talking about here or environment. It's got to be about their needs. And, some youth will use unhealthy coping mechanisms, won't they, to deal with that. It could be eating, it could be substances, could be relationships. We all turn to something to help us cope with our trauma, don't we? It's always got to be about what kind of works for them. I mean, just for an example, I kind of straddle the more fight or flight energy and the shutdown energy, depending on what's going on in my life. And my eating habits change massively. So I'm more into shutdown at the moment. I'm slower. Processes are a little bit slower. I'm tireder, a bit more negative in my thought processes. My eating habits are not great at the moment, Christopher. There's loads of crisps. There's comfort eating. There's, not great regularity of eating. But when I'm in a more heightened state, when I'm more upregulated, when I'm more anxious, my eating's much better then. I might go the other way then. I might overeat then. So I think it's all about getting in touch with our body. Before we go for the overeating or whatever it might be, it's like, what am I doing this for? What do I actually need?
You do this counseling, much of it online. You are practicing in the UK and you can take clients throughout Europe. Are these Zoom sessions? Are these, video chats? How do you approach telemedicine for CBT and hypnosis?
So the counselling, I don't do the counselling over telehealth. That's something I do based on my current levels of insurance and training face-to-face. I work at school and I work at a rehabilitation facility. The hypno-CBT is all on telehealth. And I can do it internationally as well. It's a little more tricky with certain states in America. You have to work towards their individual requirements, their regulatory bodies. I don't do anything different online than I would in person with the hypno-CBT. So there's some things, the creative things, particularly with young people, are a little harder when you're online. We might do in person more arty things. There's lots of things with objects you can do, buttons or stones or art or using visual cards. That all gets a bit trickier. But really, it doesn't make a lot of difference to me whether, and the connection, Christopher, the connection is like I can sense, I'm getting a very regulated sense from you right now. We're sitting across the screen. My nervous system is fitting in beautifully with your nervous system, I feel right now. But with another person who was more heightened, I can very easily match theirs, which isn't always what's required in a therapy session. So I'm very good at sensing how that person is, in their body. And the fact that we do this over Zoom, thousands of miles away, I find fascinating. But that's neuroception. That's just my nervous system talking to your nervous system. So beautifully, it works online. Two nervous systems in the presence of each other. It's co-regulation. And I love how that works. And maybe it isn't the same for everyone. Maybe as an autistic person, my neuroception is heightened. I suspect it might be because we are wired a bit differently. Maybe some neurotypical therapists don't feel that like I do. I don't really know. But for me, it works the same as it does in person.
I could think of a lot of reasons why online would be beneficial for individuals like my daughters. Travel is stressful. Going to the building is stressful. Sitting in the waiting room is stressful. By doing it online for the last 2 or 3 years, as we have had to do, it limits the number of disruptions. It limits the amount of sensory input because we can be in an office, mommy or daddy's office. We can even set up a laptop in one of their bedrooms. So in some ways, it's more comforting because it's an environment that feels safe without all of the disruption to get to a new environment that's not yours. Is that an oversimplification, or are there benefits for some autistics to the telemedicine approach?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a massive, massive part of it that this telemedicine, telehealth is so accessible, because this is what it's about. You've just listed all of the reasons why It can use up all of your spoons, that disability metaphor of spoons, energy units, just getting to a place. Have you got the right place? Where do I park? What happens if I'm late? You can literally turn your computer on from your bed. And like I say, I've got no problems if people rock up, with their PJs on. It's very accessible. And as we know, autism can be disabling. It's accessible for people who are disabled by the social expectations or needs that they're faced with on a day-to-day basis. If it means using a portion of your spoons, your energy units, and not half of them or 3/4 of them, then yes, why not? Why not give telehealth a go?
And beyond this, you are working with the Irish organizations Thriving, Autistic, and the Adult Autism Practice.
Mm-hmm.
What does thriving as an autistic mean? What is it to thrive with autism?
It's about being your authentic self. It's about expressing your needs, knowing your needs, firstly. It's about knowing your kinship with other neurodivergent folks, whether they're autistic or otherwise. It's about being the best you, given whatever your challenges might be with your autisticness. And obviously that could be sensory, whatever it is your spectrum of difficulty. It's thriving within that, but also thriving within the social sphere. I'm thinking of the workplace, for example. If you're autistic and you're in the workplace, how do you thrive in that workspace? Do you need accommodations, a different working environment, shorter days, work from home? How do you thrive and be your best self? Not a neurotypical version of yourself. How do you be your best self? I think a lot of us, especially young people, obviously you're growing up not really knowing why you're different and why you see things so differently, very marginalised. You're not really thriving necessarily then, you're kind of getting by. I got by my whole life really. But now I'm thriving because I know myself and I prize myself and I value the autistic benefits actually that I have, like this sort of connectedness with people. I feel that's an autism aspect.
I want to touch on something that CBT might be able to help with. Throughout the world now, we are slowly attempting to at least pretend the pandemic is over. Many autistics that I work with and talk to, my colleagues, they're now experiencing the stress of trying to return to normal, but because they're obsessed with information, they know that there is still a pandemic.
Yeah.
And so they're dealing with the stress of having to return back to university or a workplace, and yet they still watch the numbers. They still see, oh, this Omicron COVID variant is killing X number of people. How are we going to help autistics and especially those who suffer from anxiety, neurodiverse in general? How do we help transition back to this stage where the world is pretending it's normal, but we kind of know it's not normal? How do we use CBT, Hypnosis, CBT? How can we use these to help us reintegrate after 3 years?
Yeah, so many of us really quite enjoyed the lockdown. And I know so much, negativity and scary things were happening. Very, very difficult time, obviously. But I see so many people, and I'd include myself in this, who liked the enforced isolation. They appreciated that pause button being put on us. And they don't necessarily want to go back to that busy, crazy, shaking hands, highly sociable environment that we all had to deal with. I guess a bit of it is about needs. So if it's the workplace, it's, what are my needs and not my business's needs? What are my needs and how might I express them in a way that serves the business, but doesn't mean I'm back commuting every day or back contacting people all the day in big open plan offices? How do my needs now match? I think there's a lot of acceptance that we need to work on, just that sense of, particularly if you're a person who gets a bit obsessive, has compulsions, or just a very tightly wound, more anxious person. There's a lot to be said about just knowing your triggers for stuff. What I'm feeling X, why am I feeling it? What about today has made me feel that? What is it about the world as it's happening that is triggering me and making me feel whatever the thing is? What scares me? And really getting to know yourself. Is it going out into the open spaces? Is it the enforced communication with people? Is it literally the fear of getting ill? Really digging down a bit. Maybe, CBT is great for beliefs. Just really digging down, spending some time with a loved one, or therapist or whoever, just what are my beliefs and could I change? We're a bit black and white, aren't we? Could I change that? How could I see this in a different light? What's the worst that can happen? List all the things that could happen, and they're going to be awful. You can all think of terrible things. Work out what the likelihood is of that. What percentage chance is there of this happening? Use that logic and that pattern spotting to work out the rationality of stuff. I think there's, lots of ways we can use these cognitive processes to help us integrate into whatever we want it to be, this new way of being and living. And for a lot of us, it's a chance to create a new lifestyle, whether that's homeschooling, whether that's working from home, whether that's starting your own business. It's a crossroads for a lot of people, I think.
In this very stressful world of ours, how does a therapist separate what is or isn't a reasonable stress anymore? You mentioned holistic, right? The whole body, the whole mind. I know that I worry constantly now about every time someone's coughing or sneezing on transit near me, or, when I have to go out to the doctor's office. I was shocked yesterday when I had a doctor's appointment for the eldest, and all of the medical staff around her were not wearing masks. And I felt near panic.
Yeah.
Lee and I have our N95s on, and we're trying to be careful at this medical clinic. None of the medical clinic is masked or worried. So how do I start telling myself, and how do I help Lee and anyone else in my life? How do we separate what is or isn't reasonable, and how can we approach these using CBT methods?
Yeah, what is or isn't reasonable? It's sort of tricky, isn't it, to really know what to do, because the trick is to know when you're reacting to something, not responding. So all of anxiety is a very natural and normal response, isn't it? But sometimes, like the panic, is often not quite congruent with the situation. So I think it's helpful to us to know, almost like I alluded to a few moments ago, what are our triggers for anxiety? And then you can almost have a conversation with yourself as like a higher self, an observing self, and go, okay, I'm feeling heightened, my heart's beating, I'm getting a bit angry with this folk around me, feeling irritable, they're not wearing the masks. What is that about? Am I reacting to some deeper fear, some uncertainty, change, transitions we weren't expecting? They can all trigger us massively as autistic folk. It's about working out am I in danger right now? What's the truth of the matter? And if I am reacting, okay, what can I do differently? How can I respond carefully, sensitively, sensibly? Okay, I can breathe. I can do that at least. I can regulate myself. I can find something cold to put on my wrists. I can stick my headphones on and have some calming music or something. Is my response congruent to the amount of stress around me? And I think if we can respond to the threat in question, that is at least some skill, isn't it? And we might need to take with us to outside places a handbag, a purse, a rucksack, maybe some stuff in there we might need, like the headphones, something to smell, something cold, a little one of those ice pack things. What if I get triggered? Okay, what calms me down? And look after ourselves, wear masks, do whatever we need to stay safe. Don't accept the social invitation. There's nothing wrong with that. State your needs. I don't want to come to your party. It's about our needs, I think, at the end of the day.
And that's something I'd like to end on. You emphasize on the website and elsewhere in our communications, you've emphasized self-care and that value of self-care, knowing your needs, taking care of yourself. I've mentioned on the podcast and blog, the girls and I, we do our daily hour of exercise that often includes yoga, stretching for them. We are doing our breathing exercises, trying to slow our bodies down, take a break. Self-care is something that is so easy to ignore because we're so busy wanting to please everyone else, to care for someone else. You're a mother, you're a therapist, you're a counselor. And it's very easy for me to put my children first, my students first, everything around me first except me. And then I burn out and then I'm useless.
Yeah.
So how do we prioritize that self-care?
Oh, it's so hard as a parent, isn't it? I mean, they say, don't they, on the planes, put your mask on first. And I think we just have to remember that in life. Put your mask on first. You can't pour from an empty cup. You're no good to your kids if you're burnt out in bed. I'm quite tuned into my self-care needs. I burn out. I burnt out a few weeks ago. It takes days and days to recover sometimes. As I say, I spent most of my teenage years constantly in burnout. For me, it's really getting to know yourself, and that can be, what state am I in? Am I safe and social and connected? We're not there very often, by the way. Am I flighty or fighty? Am I a bit irritated? Am I heightened? Is my heartbeat faster? Or am I just numb? You know, if someone says, how are you? You're just like, I don't know, don't care. There's the numbness, there's a slowness, there's a real lack of upregulation. If we can just get to know our needs. So just an example, when I'm heading to shutdown, and I literally only worked this out within the last 12 months, Christopher, I get a tightness like a halo around my eyes. And I thought it was a sight issue. It's not. It's in my brain. It's part of my wiring. And that for me is an early trigger of heading to burnout or getting in that shutdown phase. And to start with, I'll be like, oh, you know, maybe I need an eye test. It's sort of linked to sleep sometimes, but not necessarily. So I know now what my little triggers are. So I think if we know what makes us feel like we're heading to an unhealthier place, it could be eating, couldn't it? You don't take care of your eating patterns. You eat too much. You don't eat enough. Drink too much, maybe. All of those little things. Getting ratty with your kids. Just all those little aspects. Know what your triggers are and know what your solutions are. So music for me, I need to upregulate. Like now I'm more into this shutdowny vibe. Music, I love punk, I love rock. I love stuff that lifts me in a bit of an angry way. You know, when you're shut down, we don't often get angry. I don't know if you've noticed that. We get a bit numb to everything. I like stuff that fires me up. So, you know, I would go for a walk and have some punk music. We're each to their own. We'll all find stuff that works for us. But yeah, regulate. It could be yoga. It could be Pilates. It could be Tai Chi. It could be running. Whatever your thing is, find what gets you back to where you're comfy and where you feel safe.
For those interested in what you do you have a website or social media presence we can refer to?
I do. So my website is arrivetherapy.co.uk and I'm on Instagram, Your Holistic Therapist.
I really want to thank Kathy Carter for joining us. Again, Kathy's website is arrivetherapy.co.uk, where you can learn more about holistic hypnotherapy and hypno-CBT. Kathy is available in the UK and throughout Europe online. Unfortunately, as she said, it is so complicated here in the United States. Some of these services are limited on availability. And that's just a sad reality, I think, of the borders, our fake borders that we create as humans between each other. But your website does have information on what holistic hypnotherapy is and what some of your approaches are. I appreciate that that's up there and online, Kathy.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there on neurodiversity, blogs, the odd little podcast. There's a few little nuggets out there that people might find useful. Have a look.
I thank you, and I thank you as a parent. I know you said your son is close to the same age as my daughters. We share that neurodiverse household issue, the ADHD, the autism, in our case, also just extreme introverts. I love being in my office instead of somewhere else.
Yeah, me too.
It has been a pleasure. I hope listeners to the Autistic Me podcast have enjoyed listening to another autistic voice. I'm always honored to have guests as knowledgeable and as experienced as yourself. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christopher. It's been a real pleasure.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Perspectives on Neurodiversity. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, and please leave a review if you found the discussion useful. Don't forget to read the Autistic Me blog and follow my posts on social media. Look for Autistic Me as one word on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Links to the Autistic Me on social media are included in the show notes. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Thank you for listening.